Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. Today's game has a mix of commanders, some new, some old. First up, we have Matt, who won the die roll playing Bria, Riptide Rogue. He's going to sling some spells with his prowessy Is It Spellslinger deck. Second in the turn order is Chris playing Darien, King of Geldor, or is it Keldor? I don't know. His plan's simple. Take damage, make dudes. Kyle's next with Mr. House, President and CEO. He'll focus on making a bunch of treasures and rolling a ton of dice. And I'm playing Baylen the Haymaker. I'm having fun with this one. I'll try to make a monsoon of tokens and use them to take advantage of Baylen's abilities. Please subscribe if you haven't already and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Matt kicks us off by playing Thundering Falls. He'll surveil one, keeping it on the top. He passes the turn to Chris. He draws and plays a Plains. And then he casts Guide of Souls. So he'll start gaining life and making energy whenever his creatures ETB. On to Kyle's turn, he draws, plays Sunbaked Canyon, and passes the turn over to me. I'll play Temple Garden as my land for turn, shocking that bad boy in order to play a Gilded Goose. This will make me a food token, after which I'll pass the turn back over to Matt. On his turn 2, he plays an Opt in that fancy Japanese art. So he gets a Scry, he'll put that on the bottom of his library, then he'll get the draw as well. He plays a Temple of Epiphany as his land for turn, scrying one more time, keeping that bad boy on top. He passes the turn to Chris. He plays another Plains as his land before casting Coppercoat Vanguard, giving his other stuff Ward 1 and +1/+0. He gains a life, gains an energy, and then he moves into combat, swinging at me for no reason at all. I drop to 36. On Kyle's turn, he shocks in a Godless Shrine, and then plays Orzhov's Signet. Get some ramp action. He then passes the turn over to me. I draw and play a Plains as my land before casting Reese the Redeemed. A little bit earlier than I wanted to, but you gotta make do with what you got, you know? I pass over to Matt. He draws and plays a Talisman of Creativity. He then immediately uses it, taking 1 point of damage, to cast Storm Chaser's Talent. This will make him an adorable 1/1 blue and red otter token. He passes over to Chris. He plays another Plains. Big surprise there. Before casting Boromir, Warden of the Tower, gaining another life and an energy as well. Afterwards, he moves into combat, swinging at Matt and Kyle, sharing some love. They take their beats, and he passes the turn. Kyle draws and plays a City of Brass as his land, and then uses that in order to cast Smothering Tithe. He took some damage from his land, and then he passes the turn over to me. I draw and decide not to pay for Smothering Tithe, so Kyle gets a treasure. I play another Plains, and then I cast Rosy Cotton of South Lane, getting another food token. She lets me put a 1/1 counter on a creature, so I put it on Reese, and then I move into the red zone with him, swinging at Kyle. He takes his beats, and then I pass the turn over to Matt. He draws, does not pay for Smothering Tithe, then he plays Young Pyromancer. This will start making him tokens if he casts instants and sorceries. He then passes over to Chris. He draws, and like a good citizen, he pays his taxes for Smothering Tithe. He then drops Idyllic Grange. It'll enter untapped, and he'll get to put a 1/1 counter on his Guide of Souls. He then moves into combat, swinging at me and Kyle. We both declare no blocks and take our beats. Afterwards, he passes. Kyle draws and plays Boros Signet, getting even more ramp. You gotta watch this guy. Afterwards, and with the help of some of his treasures, he casts Mondrak, Glory Dominus, effectively increasing his token production, so that's a problem. I draw, and then I pay for Smothering Tithe because I don't want him to make an infinite amount of treasure tokens. I then drop Legion's Landing, getting a 1/1 vampire with lifelink. And Rosie sees that, so Reese gets another +1 counter. I pass. Matt pays for Smothering Tithe as well before playing Shivan Reef. He then casts Thunderclap Drake. Again, he just needs some instants and sorceries now. Matt goes to pass, and on his end step, Chris casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Kyle's Mondrak, which is a blessing. Then, on Chris's turn proper, he draws and continues to pay for Tithe, and I'm probably going to stop talking about Smothering Tithe. He then moves into combat, swinging at Matt and myself this time. Again, no blocks are declared, so we take our damage. On Kyle's turn, he plays Verdant Catacombs as his land. Then he cracks that, taking 1 point of life, and grabs a Swamp out onto the battlefield. Using some of his painful mana, he then casts Big Score. That'll have him discard a card, drawing 2 and getting 2 more treasure tokens. Afterwards, he casts the Meat Hook Massacre. where X equals 3, effectively shrinking everything on the board to death. In response, Chris goes for a small amount of value by sacrificing Boromir to have the ring tempt him. His creatures gain indestructible, but of course, the Meat Hook Massacre still just shrinks them to death anyway. We clean up our board states. Kyle passes the turn after gaining some life. On my turn, I draw, pay for Tithe, and then I cast Avacyn's Pilgrim. A little bit mana screwed right now, so Avacyn will help. On Matt's turn, he draws, then he plays Urabrask. So when he casts his instants and sorceries, he'll gain some mana and deal some damage. What? On Chris's turn, he plays a Plains as his land for turn before casting his commander, Darien, King of Kajeldor. On to Kyle's turn, he draws and plays Sulphurous Springs. Then he casts his commander, Mr. House. And as a follow-up, he plays his favorite card in Commander, the One Ring. Indestructible draws him cards, hurts him a little bit, but that's okay. And important to note, he now has protection from everything until his next turn. He activates that, putting a burden counter on it and drawing a card. He passes, and on my turn, I find a land, yay! It's a mountain, and this allows me to play Powder Ganger. I use Squad one time, so he'll enter with a copy, I blow up his commander because it's an artifact, and I kill one of his mana rocks as well. I wish I could have killed the One Ring, but of course, it's indestructible. When his commander died, Meat Hook tells us to all lose a life. On to Matt's turn, he draws and plays a fancy ruby medallion, reducing the costs of his stuff. That's it for him. He passes to Chris, who draws, and then he plays a command tower in his mono white deck. What a scholar. He then plays Savine's Reclamation, and this will have him grab his Guide of Souls out of his bin. And, more importantly, putting Savine's Reclamation into his bin so he can use it later. On to Kyle's turn, he draws, loses life from his ring, and then activates the One Ring to draw 2 more cards. He finds an Anointed Procession and casts that, doubling up his token production. As a follow-up, he casts Tocasia's Welcome. This will have him draw a card should a small creature enter the battlefield on his board. He then casts Party Thrasher, which is small. It's a 2-drop, so it triggers Tocasia's Welcome and gets him that card draw. Afterwards, he plays a Wooded Foothills as his land for turn and passes it over to me. I draw, and then I cast my commander, Baylen the Haymaker. I have enough tokens out that I could actually do something with it, too. I'll pass the turn to Matt. He plays an island as his land before casting Reconnaissance Mission. Sadly for Matt, still no instants and sorceries, but he's trying to draw cards, so that's good. He moves into combat, swinging Urabrask at Kyle, who responds before damage by casting Get Lost. This will blow up Urabrask and make Matt 2 map tokens as a consolation prize. Kyle also responded by sacking his Wooded Foothills to go and find a Sacred Foundry, entering the battlefield tapped. Matt found his map tokens and passed the turn to Chris. On his turn, he'll draw, pay for Tithe, play a Plains as his land before casting Soul Warden. So now whenever any creature enters the battlefield, he'll gain a life. And this triggers his Guide of Souls, gaining him life as well. He then flashes back his Savine's Wreck. This will have him grab 2 of his creatures from his graveyard. This time it'll be Boromir and Coppercoat Vanguard. When those ETB, they trigger both of his life gainer dudes, so he'll gain 4 whole life. Can you believe it? Chris then moves into the red zone with his commander and Guide of Souls. He will also use Guide of Souls ability, spending some energy to buff up his commander. With no blocks declared, both Kyle and Matt will take some damage. And then on to Kyle's turn, he'll draw after losing life from the ring. When he drew, Party Thrasher triggers, so he'll discard a card in order to exile the top 2 cards of his library, choosing one of them in which he could play this turn. In this case, he finds a Brazen Dwarf, so he'll choose to cast that. This will also trigger Tocasia's Welcome. And now if he would to roll dice, he'll deal damage, so that's pretty good for him. Chris also gained some life when that ETB'd. Then he'll activate the One Ring, putting another burden counter on it and drawing 3 whole cards. This monster. From among them, he found a Reckless Fireweaver, and now we're sweating even more. So every time he makes an artifact, he'll start pinging us. He casts an artifact. It's a Soul Ring, right on time. This will trigger his Fireweaver, pinging each one of us for 1. Then he plays a Gold Span Dragon, which, if you didn't know, it makes treasure tokens. when it attacks. So he attacks Chris with it in the air. This will make 2 treasure tokens because of his anointed procession, pinging all of us twice. So Chris's commander has been triggering whenever damage is being taken. Also, before combat damage, Kyle casts Contraband Livestock, using one of the treasure tokens he made with Goldspan's attack trigger. Kyle targets Chris's commander with it, paying for the ward cost as well. Then Chris's commander will get exiled, Kyle will roll a d20, and Chris will get a thing. Chris did make 3 soldier tokens, of course, and gain some life from his life-gaining creatures. Kyle rolls his d20, Brazen Dwarf triggers, pinging each one of us 1, and because of Kyle's d20 result, Chris gets a boar thanks to Contraband Livestock. And this once again triggers his life-gaining things, so he gains life and an energy. In this whole exchange, Kyle has 1 white mana floating, so he uses that for a Swords to Plowshares, getting rid of Chris's Coppercoats. That way, his other things don't have ward anymore. But hey, Chris gained a little bit of life from that, so that's good. Kyle then passes the turn, and on his end step, I use Baylen's ability to draw a card by tapping 3 of my tokens. I can't pay for Tithe, so Kyle makes 2 treasure tokens, pinging us 2 points of damage each. Then, onto my turn, I draw Proper, decide not to pay for it, taking more damage. I cast a Quest for Renewal. Hopefully this will allow me to use Baylen's ability more. I then cast Mondrak, Glory Dominus. I'd like to make more tokens as well, Kyle. Use Avacyn's Pilgrim to help pay for Mondrak. This triggers my quest. And Chris gained a life from Mondrak. I move into combat, picking on Matt. My goal here is just to trigger Quest for Renewal. I don't even care about dealing him damage. But he does. Before damage, he casts Rapid Hybridization on my commander, so he turns poor, sweet, innocent Baylen into 2 frog lizards, which we misrepresent by using an ape on accident. That's supposed to be a frog lizard. Afterwards, combat is resolved, so Matt will eventually update his life total with 4 points of damage. Chris gains some life because of his life-gaining thing, and on the attack, my Legion's Landing flips and turns into a Danto. I then pass the turn over to Matt, and on his upkeep, my Quest for Renewal allows me to untap all of my creatures. Yay! On Matt's turn, he does not pay for Tithe, so we all take 2. Then he drops an Arcane Signet, better late than never. Then he casts Gutter Snipe, so he wants to start dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents whenever he casts instants and sorceries. He goes ahead and sacrifices a map, so he'll explore, and he reveals a Season of Weaving on the top of his library. He gets to put a 1/1 counter on his Gutter Snipe. There he goes, updating his life total from his combat damage. He then uses the map again, and reveals the same card, his Season of Weaving. He will once again leave that on top, and get another +1 counter on his Gutter Snipe. He then passes the turn over to Chris. He draws, doesn't pay for Tithe, so we each get shocked. Chris plays a Plains as his land for turn, and nearly taps out in order to recast his expensive commander, Darien, King of K. However, Kyle has a response in the form of an Orcish Bowmasters. He's trying to slow down Chris's life gain so that he could eventually actually kill him. His Bowmasters trigger, he'll target Chris's Soul Warden, and in response to that, Chris sacrifices his Boromir in order to give all of his stuff indestructible. When Boromir dies, it'll trigger the Meat Hook Massacre, so Kyle gains a life. And of note, Takasia's Welcome also triggered because of Kyle's Bowmasters. Chris moves into combat with all of his available creatures, and Kyle lines up some blocks in such a way that he takes the least amount of damage while keeping the most amount of his creatures alive. Now, of note too, when Kyle cast his Orcish Bowmasters, he amassed 1, but that resulted in him producing 2 tokens. So the second Orc army is a 0/0 with no +1/+1 counters on it, so it just dies immediately, and the Meat Hook Massacre triggered. In addition, when Boromir was sacrificed, the ring tempted Chris, he made a new ring bearer, and on the attack he had to draw a card. So Kyle's Orcish Bowmasters triggered, and he used it to ping my Avacyn's Pilgrim to death. Man, that was a lot of stuff. Anyway, Chris passed the turn over to Kyle. He took his beats from his ring, then he used his ring to draw 4 cards before playing a Haunted Ridge. Then he recasts his commander, Mr. House. That will trigger Reckless Fireweaver, and with its triggered ability on the stack, Kyle decides to destroy Chris's commander once again. He casts a Fell the Profane, so that will resolve, destroying Chris's commander, and then Reckless Fireweaver's trigger resolves, pinging everybody for 1. Kyle gains a life thanks to the Meat Hook Massacre as well. And sadly, Chris is denied a 1/1 token. Sorry, Chris. Kyle sacks his Sunbaked Canyon to draw a card. Then he casts Warren Soul Trader. This is a sacrifice outlet that will also make him treasures in order to ping us to death. Not bad. He moves into the red zone with his Goldspan Dragon at Chris, and it makes treasures on the attack, pinging each one of us for 2 once again, and then Chris takes his Goldspan Beats. Afterwards, Kyle plays an Ancient Brass Dragon. This will help him roll some dice that he wants to do in his dice rolling deck. It's also just Mardu good stuff. He then passes the turn over to me. I can't afford Tithe, so we all get shocked again. I then play Spectator Seeding. Afterwards, I recast my commander, Baylen the Haymaker. Cute little bun. I don't really have much effective attacks, so I just keep up on defense against Kyle's army. I pass the turn to Matt. He draws, we get shocked. He then moves into the red zone with his Gutter Snipe at Chris. It's pretty much just so he could draw off of Reconnaissance Mission, which of course results in us getting shocked once again. This will also trigger Kyle's Orcish Bowmasters. So he responds by using his Warren Soul Trader to sacrifice his amassed army, make him a treasure, and ping each one of us for 1 on its own, as well as trigger the Meathook Massacre. Then Orcish Bowmaster's trigger resolves, amassing 1. This lets him draw off of Tocasia's Welcome. He pings Chris with Bowmaster's damage trigger, and then we all take 4 more damage thanks to all the treasures he's made with Reckless Fireweaver. Matt then plays that Season of Weaving that we were tracking at the top of his deck. This will, first of all, trigger Gutter Snipe, having everybody take 2 points of damage. And the 2 modes that Matt selects are to copy an artifact, in this case his Arcane Signet, as well as bouncing all non-land, non-token permanents back to their owner's hands. I respond to this by sacrificing a food token in order to not die. Kyle decided not to respond to this in any way because he thought it's the best way for him to deal with Chris. As a follow-up play, Matt recasts his Storm Chaser's talent, getting that cute otter. He passed the turn to Chris, who plays a Cathar's Crusade, which isn't really what we wanted to see hit the board. He then recasts Guide of Souls, getting a +1/+1 counter on all of the things. In response to that, Kyle recasts his Orcish Bowmasters, having it ping one of his soldiers down, at least reducing the damage potential. So, once that ETBs, it gets +1 counters on all the creatures. He then casts Soul Warden, again, giving +1 counters to all of his stuff. He'll get back on the I'm gonna gain life constantly plan. He then goes into combat, swinging at Kyle with his boar and his soldiers. He stems the bleeding as much as he can by throwing his Orcish Bowmasters and his army in front of 2 of the tokens. He'll drop to 9. Then Chris passes the turn. Kyle draws, plays Spectator Seeding as his land. He recasts his Goldspan Dragon, allowing him to get some hasty damage in and make more treasures. He'll use his Pain land to help pay for Reckless Fireweaver. Then he moves into combat, swinging once again at Chris with the highest life total. This will, on the attack, make a treasure token, and that damage is enough to knock Matt out of the game. Sorry, Matt. Chris took his beats. Kyle, in his second main phase, plays Soul Ring, dealing more damage to each one of us. Just remember that he gained life from Goldspan and Fireweaver. Kyle then plays Boros Signet, pinging each one of us for 1 again, and a Talisman of Conviction is enough to knock me out of the game. Kyle follows that up by playing his Anointed Procession, making his token production better. He then casts the One Ring once again. Most importantly here is that it gives him protection from everything until his next turn. He recasts his commander, Mr. House, President and CEO. This will ping Chris once again because of Fireweaver, but he gains the life too. Brazen Dwarf is his next play, and Chris once again gains more life. Kyle passes. On Chris's turn, he plays a Well of Lost Dreams. It's really scraping the bottom of the barrel and his hand size is very low. So he has to just pass the turn over to Kyle, who draws, plays Command Tower as his land for turn, and just goes right into combat at Chris, making 2 more treasure tokens, getting shocked by Fireweaver, and then taking 4 damage from Goldspan Dragon. Kyle uses those treasures to help pay for the Meathook Massacre, where X equals 4. This will shrink down everything of Chris's to death, as well as Kyle's, but the Meathook triggers and brings them both to 13 points of life. He follows that up by playing Tocasia's Welcome again, and recasting his commander, therefore drawing a card from Tocasia's Welcome. On Chris's turn, he top decks in a Johnny's Welcome, plays that, and hopes that he'll be able to start playing more creatures. Back over to Kyle, he recasts his Party Thrasher. This will trigger, and he'll get another card draw. He finds a Will Blade of Frontiers, so he puts that out onto the battlefield, and then he casts his Ancient Brass Dragon once again. And Kyle is really just able to draw a ton more cards than Chris at this point. He does have to pass the turn, and Chris top decks a Disenchant. He decides to have it kill his Anointed Procession, and passes the turn back over to Kyle. He draws, Party Thrasher replaces that ability, therefore exiling 2 cards should Kyle discard, which he did. He says, I'm never going to cast those 2 cards. So he moves into combat, swinging at Chris. He'll deal Chris 9 points of damage with those attacks. And his Ancient Brass Dragon will trigger, allowing him to roll a d20. And he basically gets to roll with advantage for all of you D&D players out there because of his will. So he gets a 15 as a result. Mr. House sees that. Kyle gets to have a robot token created and a treasure, and then he'll resolve the Ancient Brass Dragon's ability. Because he rolled a 15 with his d20, he gets 15 mana value worth of creatures back from any graveyard and out onto the battlefield. So he finds all of his good stuff, and including a Soul Warden and a Boromir from Chris's. He brings Chris down to 3 points of life in that exchange. Then he activates his commander, Mr. House, rolling a total of 4d6s. This will also trigger Brazen Dwarf, pinging Chris for 1. And given his dice results, he gets to make another robot, which Reckless Fireweaver will ping him 1 more time. Finally, Kyle casts Warren Soul Trader once again. And he'll activate its ability, sacrificing a robot. This will make Kyle a treasure token, which is enough to knock Chris out of the game, thanks to his Reckless Fireweaver. So that makes Kyle the winner. Congratulations, bud. An interesting dice rolling Mardu good stuff Mr. House deck. And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it, that's the game. We hope you enjoyed the game. If you did, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching.